Welcome. Welcome to our second session series of the Call to Transformative Love, Narratives of Race, Place, and Grace. We're delighted to have you with us this afternoon, this evening, all the coasts, and even internationally. As we do some introductory remarks, if you would like to just put in the chat where you come from, that would be wonderful to know where and how you come. And we have two welcomes. First of all, my name is Sister Maria Simperman. I'm a religious of the Sacred Heart of Jesus, and I'm an associate professor of theological ethics here at Catholic Theological Union. I'm also the founding director of our Center for the Study of Consecrated Life. So it's delightful to have you. First welcome is to Sister Josita Colbert. She's a sister of Notre Dame de Namur and the president of the National Black Catholic Sisters Conference. So Sister Josita, please.
Yes, welcome, and good evening, everyone, or good morning. I'd like to say welcome on behalf of the National Black Sisters Conference. We're an organization of Black religious women and associates founded in 1968 for the sole purpose of being supportive to African American women, as well as to confront the sin of racism as it affects our people. So once again, we are glad to collaborate with those organizations that will join us in that fight against the sin of racism, injustice of any kind. And we're happy to collaborate once again with the Center for the Study of Consecrated Life to continue the conversation and action, not only to talk about it, but to take some action against the sin of racism and how it impacts the lives of each and every one of us. So thank you and welcome. Thank you again for coming.
Thank you, Sister Josita. What I'd like to do is just offer some introductory remarks and set the context for what we are about. And as is our practice, to do an acknowledgement of the place and those who've gone before us in it and cared for the land. And Chicago is on the land that the tribes of the Illinois, Miami, and Potawatomi lived, thrived, cared for the land, and other groups as well. And so we pray that we may be responsible and caring people on this earth, with the people, with the air, with the water, the land, all areas, so that generations upon generations upon generations may also be able to thrive here. So also want to acknowledge that one of the points to be noted is, who are the leaders? Who are the peoples that often are unspoken about and who have had such an impact? And so in Chicago, depending on how you pronounce his name, Jean-Baptiste Point du Sable is really the founder of Chicago and has this rich story that we're only really beginning to acknowledge in Chicago and in the United States. I also want to acknowledge Sister Thea Bowman, FSPA, who's our patron for this work that we are about. And so I thank them all of these people who've come before us and who started what we need to continue. So with that acknowledgement, I also just want to invite you to this second series. Many of you, and thank you for that, were part of a really profound November 3-session series that began a conversation. And if you didn't have the opportunity to be part of it, then the videos are all recorded and available on Learn at CTU. And I invite you to watch them, ponder, have conversations. We had such a outpouring of desire for more, that with this wonderful partnership, with the Black Catholic Sisters Conference, and in thanks also to the Hilton Foundation's Catholic Sisters Initiative and their support of this. It's with our little planning committee of Sister Josita, you've met, Sister Gail Lawanga, a Good Shepherd sister, and Sister Anita Baird, daughter of the Heart of Mary, that we looked at what this next set might be calling us to. And so while the first was such a profound moment, we decided to build on this and to deepen the conversation. And so to have fewer speakers for the first two, but to try to go down a little deeper in what we need to listen to and hear. But the other piece about this, and it was Sister Josita who mentioned it, is we also are going to have small groups. And here, I'm going to ask you to not leave after the input, because that could be the space where the next level moves us, if you would stay. To deepen the conversation, we don't change without conversations, without both the sharing and the listening. And it's not enough, really, to simply take in information. We know that. And I also want to say we need not be good at this. Many of us are not that good at difficult conversations. But being willing to be in the conversation and simply listen and to offer some of our own reflections does make a difference and will make a difference. It doesn't mean this is without pain. And I have been trying to listen to people on all ends of these conversations. For some, this is really painful. For all of us, it needs to be painful information. But to say, what is this calling us to? This means this is a beginning of the process. And to be across congregations for some dialogue and with others who desire to deepen their commitment to this anti-racism work, which we really need in our church, in this nation, and in our world, is so important. So I ask you, stay, don't leave. Be willing to stay to learn with one another, because we have to do this together. And this first session is looking at the story of the Catholic Church and our history in the midst of this. So thank you ahead of time for being willing to listen, to ask to be transformed, and to do this together. And so now I turn to Sister Josita and invite you to introduce our speaker. Thank you.
Thank you, Maria. Our presenter, our speaker this evening is a member of the Society of Jesus and the National Black Catholic Clergy Caucus. He is an educator, scholar, artist, writer, a deeply spiritual man, and a drum major for justice. He has served on many committees. He is a renowned world speaker, publisher. He earned his doctorate in American Studies from Yale University. And there's many more. In fact, I have several papers here to say about our speaker, but I think what's key is what he learned at his grandmother's knee. And that is, Joseph, stay in good trouble. And so I am happy and proud to introduce to you the Reverend Dr. Joseph A. Brown, S.J. Reverend.
Anybody asking who you are, who you are, who you are? Anybody ask you who you are? Tell him you're a child of God. Anybody ask you who I am, who I am, who I am? Anybody ask you who I am? Tell him I'm a child of God. A peace on earth, Mary rocked the cradle, Mary rocked the cradle, Mary rocked the cradle, a peace on earth. Mary rocked the cradle, tell you, he was a child of God. Mm, mm, Anybody ask you who he is, who he is, who he is? Anybody ask you who he is? Tell him, oh, tell him he's a child of God. Anybody ask you who you are, who I am, who he is? Anybody ask you who you are? Tell him I'm a child of God. Tell him now he's a child of God. But tell him she's a child of God. Tell him you're a child of God. That's it.
And that indeed is it. I have had students for years ask me, how come you always call me a child of God? And as usual, Sister Josita brought me right into the teary-eyed state of life because that's where I learned it. But I've been teaching courses on the spirituals for a long time now. And one of the reasons I teach it is because that's what I wrote my master's thesis and my dissertation about. How the spirituals are not some old-timey, let's forget about slavery relic of the past. They are the most deliberate, focused, and sophisticated challenge to racism. I could do a half an hour on just this one song. Anybody asks you who you are, you tell them you're a child of God. Now, you want to talk about the history of racism? There are three versions or three editions of Frederick Douglass's autobiography: 1845, 1855, 1883. And he titles his first book, The Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, an American Slave, written by himself. He had to put written by himself into that title because people were challenging him every time he stood up in public after he got to the North. He's not really telling the truth. He's just memorizing the things that those white men, those abolitionists have put in his mouth. He couldn't be that smart because after all, he's Black. Well, as my students learn after we start to talk about that book, that wasn't his name. And all the different slave narratives we go into, you see people taken off of their land, their home. Names were changed. Abuse was inflicted to break their spirits as children. And when they came here to the New World, they were called whatever anybody felt like calling them. So I don't think of this as some great performance piece to have somebody picking up a child or my grandmother pulling me into her embrace saying, anybody ask you who you are, you tell them you're a child of God. Because that was the only corrective available. But it was an announcement to the world. I don't care what you call me. Your definitions of me will never prevail, which is why I start off every semester with who defines the terms by which we live. And what is institutional racism? It is the structure by which people of privilege and power can exercise their control over others by defining them in ways that keep them inferior, submissive, and vulnerable. That's what institutional oppression is. This system will keep defining you out of your fullness. I don't care what your identity is or what identity you claim. This system will make sure you never, ever are able to achieve it. So what did these people from Africa do? They claimed their fullness every time they started a song. What is the reaction to racism? Anybody ask you who I am, you tell them, I'm a child of God. Mary had a baby. She rocked him in a weary land. And she told him he was a child of God. That is the first act of correctiveness. Now, I guess I'm stuck with this since y'all decided that you were going to name Thea Bowman as the spiritual guide for this whole thing. I guess I'm just going to have to quote her, ain't I? Not like she'd let me get away with it otherwise. The first series of this thing that happened way back when I talked about her great speech, one of the great canonical texts of Black Catholicism today, the speech she gave to the bishops in that wheelchair, having done another bout with chemotherapy, wrapped up, and she starts singing, what does it mean to be Black and Catholic? Sometimes I feel like a motherless child. And then she hit the paragraph that I think should be inscribed over every house where any of us live. What does it mean to be Black and Catholic? It means I come to my church fully functioning. Now, I come to my church fully functioning. Again, I could do a whole hour on that. But here's something that also ties into what Sister Maria started out with. That doesn't frighten you, does it? That doesn't frighten you? She's talking to the bishops. This usually in health tall Black woman, trained voice, PhD, sitting there talking to these men who owe their endowments to African people and the land that was shown in the map here. And she says, I come to my church fully functioning, and that doesn't frighten you. Oh yeah, it scares the hell out of them. And almost everybody in this assembly tonight knows that for a fact because you've been reading the papers lately, or you've read the papers all your life. Of course that frightens the power structure because they are there to maintain the ability to define the other. And when the other walks in and says, oh, excuse me, I'm sorry, did you realize this is my church? And you don't have to put me through an incredible process of forming me to become assimilated and respectable because I came in here fully functioning. Now, as we want to talk about the transformation of religious and consecrated life, racism is at the heart of this. Because I don't know any religious community that set foot on this continent that did not define people from Africa as less than human, and that their main identity was economic reality. No, nobody escaped that. The Catholic Church in America owes its existence to Africans. But then, you got to almost say that the Catholic Church pretty much owes its whole reality of ritual and a lot of its theology to Africans. I mean, those people who went into Africa and started knocking people around, calling them witch doctors, those people who were called pagans, when you stop and study the great sophisticated theology of the peoples of Africa, you discover that most of the devotions and rituals and structures of Catholicism came from that soil. Again, I could do another whole chapter on mysticism and play nothing but Black songs to show how Christianity in this country or in the New World, Christianity has the same process of performance that you would find in a Carmelite monastery in Spain in the 1500s. The theology of the church militant, the church triumphant, the church suffering is also called the Congo cosmogram, called the 4 moments of the sun, where people are born, they become adults, they become elders, and they move into the next world as the living dead, upon whom we stand and gain our perspective. That's that Sankofa bird that you have seen as a logo in this series. It's the circle. I'm moving forward, I'm born, I become an adult, I reach to my past, and I stand on the solid ground where my living dead ancestors inhabit my community. Racism has been justified by one scholar after, or so-called scholar after another, going all the way back into some of the writings of the fathers and mothers of the desert, where somebody was having some night sweats and some bad dreams and decided to envision the devil and his temptations during that night in the cave as a Black woman. Blackness becoming negative in the Catholic vocabulary. It continues on. We know that how we are taught Black Catholic history is almost as pitiful and pathetic as studying Black history in America, when you've got 4 people basically who are the embodiment of all of Black history, and they all got stamps. But when you study the history that Cyprian Davis, and getting ready to do this talk, I started looking at some of Cyprian's writings and just became overwhelmed by the fact that he was a poet. There are 2 sections of the book that I want to pay attention to, because the other guiding spirit of sanctity that is part of our endeavor here is Martin de Porres. Now, we know that Martin de Porres has this hagiography that goes on for centuries. But do we recognize him as Cyprian Davis, of all people, recognized him? And I'm going to read a paragraph from the History of Black Catholics. No matter what may have been the external expressions of humility and self-effacement, non-threatening virtues in a Black saint fulsomely recorded by his biographers, here's Cyprian: the persistence and strength of character required for such an arduous ministry. Persistence and strength of character. I come to my church fully functioning, Thea said. Required for such an arduous ministry as he exercised, revealed a Martin both mature and heroic, not a boy, but a man, not a tentative novice, but a powerhouse of ministry, who by the grandeur of his holy life became the embodiment of a people. Martin de Porres, in the mind of Cyprian Davis, became the embodiment of a people and the revelation of another side to the Catholic Church in New Spain. In him, and this is where I just want to thank Cyprian over and over. In him, Africa's roots bore fruit in holiness. Through him, Africa's sons and daughters made the Catholic Church their own. I come to my church fully functioning. It is this church, both African and Spanish, that later was to lay the foundation of the Black Catholic community in what is now the United States. And that leads me into my first rant of the evening, maybe. I get real tired of people who want to go back and organize their new way of thinking around that great series of articles published by the New York Times called the 1619 Project. Come on, people. Y'all say you're Catholic. In a little mission colored church and school in East St. Louis, I found out about how those African people were down there in St. Augustine, Florida, long before there was anybody in Virginia enslaved. We all know that, but we don't know the implications of it. Why is that? Because this is my point for the evening. Everybody we know who has taught us anything about being Catholic and American has participated in what I call the dominant narrative of the white male Protestant landowner, who is the epitome of the fullness of being a true American. You want to see the fulfillment of the American dream? White male Protestant landowner. That's who wrote the Constitution. That's who the Constitution was written to support. All the amendments. And owning land meant owning people. Our first bishop, John Carroll, of the Roman Catholic clergy of Maryland, with their 10,000 acres plus of plantation land, and all of those enslaved people. And Cyprian talks about how he was really, really, really torn up ethically and morally. Yeah, he was. And this is what Cyprian says about Archbishop Carroll of Maryland. He was faced with the American problem of slavery and racism. In the end, he tried to meet the demands of his conscience, the pastoral needs of his people, and the standards of American public opinion. I'm going to come back to that one. His dilemma and his failure became the dilemma and failure of the American church. Now, how do we see the effects of racism in the lives we have to live, the communities that are our home base? The standards of American public opinion. Look at what Cardinal Gregory had to say when the Knights of Columbus allowed Donald Trump to corrupt the image of Catholicism. The Knights of Columbus are the epitome of the assimilation into the white male Protestant narrative. They were founded because there was such an anti-Catholicism in this country that they had to put together benevolent societies, insurance agencies, and the protection of their own immigrants. I'm happy for that. I am very happy for it. But at this point, we don't see them being prophetic witnesses to social justice and their leadership, because we know they have arrived by the amount of money they have in their endowment, and the people they banquet with and feast with are not the impoverished children at the border of this country. Racism has been the way to harm Catholics when they first got here, and a testing ground for their full assimilation once they went through the process of becoming American. James Baldwin says it beautifully. Other people have said it eloquently. You came here with one name and one ethnic identity, and in order to become American, you had to become white. Think about the Catholic school system, the Catholic healthcare system, the Catholic parishes. There is no such thing as the Catholic Church in America, any more than there is such a thing as the Black community. Because we know the problem that we all face in our urban areas is all of those national Catholic parishes that were fiercely, fiercely jealous of their cultural identities. Once those people could assimilate and become more and more American, they left those churches to crumble, and those of us who were left over managed to move into them. But it's not anymore the Lithuanians or the Polish or the Romanians or the German or the Irish or the French or the Italians, except on the major feast days when they come back and party like crazy. But that was the Catholic Church. And there was such fierce, ugly, brutal, deathly anti-Catholicism that we had to have our own schools. The church had to have its own schools. Those churches had to have their own schools. They had to have their own systems and organizations and institutions for survival. And I am proud of what they did and how they persisted, but at the expense of the native indigenous, the African exploited, and women, period. The institutional ways. When I stop and think about those first two organizations, congregations of Black women religious, and how the bishops wanted to make sure that they worked in their ministry to be housekeepers to white clerics, but they started schools. They brought the same intensity and vision and spirit that all the other religious women did, but it was never a metaphor. It was never a choice. When you stop and read about what the women religious congregations did to the sisters of the Holy Family to stop them from being able to wear the habit, how they had to be legally incorporated by a group of lay people out of their self-protection so they could grow. And those women didn't have strict segregational principles of who they would take care of during yellow fever. They were the heroes of New Orleans, for instance. And they built institutions. But there were still bishops who wanted them to come in. Until in my own lifetime, some of them were still being asked to be housekeepers at Notre Dame Seminary in New Orleans. Well, after all, isn't that what you people? Now, the impulse of racism in our church, I come to my church fully functioning. That doesn't make you nervous, does it? Oh, yeah, that scares me a lot. It scares me a lot, but it's okay. I don't care about how it scares. It's that uncomfortable truth. But here's the problem I have with moving into assimilation into American society. Where is the prophetic urgency in the quote establishment that defines the terms for all of us? Prophetic witness versus respectability politics is a question I would like to have people think about today. But let's get into our religious communities. I could also do a 2-hour event on just telling personal stories of racism that I have experienced since I was 7 years old in the Roman Catholic Church, that I'm conscious of. But I could really do a lot on the racism I've experienced since I walked into the Jesuit novitiate in 1962. I didn't have to study traumatic stress disorder. I have lived it. And it all comes down to who defines the terms. But here's the question I really want to throw out. Why? Why have we failed in the most important aspect of our religious building of institutions, the schools? Here are four things that I think are important to understand the schools, and then I will open this up to our religious communities. First thing, those schools were established, as I said, with all of these various ethnic minorities coming in who were under siege and attacked by the anti-Catholicism of America. The schools were established to maintain the cultural integrity and the religious integrity of those ethnic populations. That's the first thing, to maintain their integrity. And the second one was to make sure that those children of those immigrants became so well socialized that they could become included into American society. That second generation of immigrant, they had to learn what everybody else was learning, but what was denied to them. So we created a school system so they could become integrated into American society in a very effective way. And here's the one for tonight. Those schools also provided a seedbed for religious and clerical vocations. And that's where our conversation has to look at racism. Because the schools that were open for those underprivileged minorities, there was never a thought that we're going to do for you people what our schools did for us. The unintended consequences of institutional racism. My sophomore year in high school, this nun stopped me in the hallway one day and said, I was the only Black person in the whole building. No janitors, no cooks, no nothing, nobody but me. And she said, Joseph, have you ever thought about a religious vocation? No. She said, well, I think you might have a religious vocation. You might want to look into becoming a brother. I was a sophomore in high school, but my grandmama was the one who raised me. You remember Sister Josita? So I said, excuse me, sister, don't you have a brother who's a priest? Well, yes, I do. I said, so you don't think I'd be good enough to be a priest? Well, let's see now. She still hasn't called to answer that question. That was 1959? Yeah. Okay. That's how I was looked at. The smartest student in the school, I was told 10 years after I graduated by one of my professors, by one of my teachers. He said, you used to stump the teachers. We used to go to the teachers' lounge and wonder, who did you stump last? I used to, freshman year, no, sister, you got that wrong. That's not the way that worked at all, because I was reading books and maybe they weren't. I don't know. But I could not be valedictorian, even though I was tutoring some of the people who had higher grade point averages than me, because it was unthinkable that I could ever be fully functioning according to those definitions. They were doing a good thing to bring me into this school. And the food that was left on our front porch, the clothes that were left there at Thanksgiving time, they were doing a great work for their own sense of charity. But to be incorporated, to be sought out, to come into that institution because I was supposed to be able to come in there. No, I wasn't recruited. And that's the fourth principle that I see about our schools. Every institution, I learned this in my first class of sociology, one of the primary functions of any institution is to find a way for it to continue through time. That's our vocations. What would our religious communities, our educational institutions look like if we decided as a Roman Catholic Church not to publish another letter on racism, but to say that in the next 20 years, we will go out and find young women and men among the Lakota, the Shoshone, the Potawatomi? What would it mean to say that the Cristo Rey schools in Chicago, for instance, had at least 3 people working on vocational development for those young women and men? Not going to happen. Never has happened. What would the society of Jesus be like if their first priority was to go and work and minister among the descendants of the 272 enslaved Africans who were sold by the Jesuits in Maryland? That to work and minister in such a way that some of their descendants would want to become Jesuits, or Sisters of the Sacred Heart, or Dominicans, or Ursuline, whoever. How would the world be if we went into those communities, church, not to do charity for the Campaign for Human Development, but to understand that there will be no church if we do not understand that we have to hand over all of our institutions and stop looking at it from the point of view of the white privilege that we have attained by assimilating into American society. That's not happening yet. Well, times have changed since, Vatican II, et cetera, and on and on. Yes, I know all of that. I know all of that. But I also know that reconciliation is the first element for reparations. I also know that when we want to start talking about the implications of racism for religious life today, put Thea up there, because in some ways, what Cyprian said about Martin de Porres, people are saying about why she should be canonized quicker. She didn't leave her religious community. She persisted. When I'm getting ready soon and very soon to celebrate my 60th anniversary in the Society of Jesus, I have given up all hope that anyone would ever come to me and apologize for how I have been treated. I was too dumb, I was told. I did not have the academic qualifications and abilities to be ordained a priest, and I was told that 3 weeks before my diaconate ordination. A few years later, I was told that I did not have the academic qualifications to get a PhD. So those 4 degrees that I got from Yale must have been forged. I was told when I was fired from Xavier University in an act that was as corrupt as anything I have ever experienced, and it had to deal with economics, that I wasn't suited for religious life. And I was going to be dismissed from the Society of Jesus, except that I had a friend who understood the technicalities and the legalities better than the provincial did. So I'm still here. No one has ever apologized for any of that. We said you were too dumb. We said you were too unstable. We said you don't fit well into community life. The 2 nervous breakdowns I had, the 2 years of therapy, and the continuing effects of traumatic stress. Oh, that's not our fault. Let us do a complete, humble reflection and examination of our collective institutional conscience. Because while I say, let's have Martin de Porres, let's have Thea Bowman, let's also have Antona Ebo. When the three young Black women wanted to go into that religious community and had to sleep in a separate building and eat at a separate table, I don't know about anybody else, but at one of my anniversaries of ordination, I wanted to make sure that Sister Antona Ebo vested me, because her life is something I can wrap around me at any time where I'm feeling isolated. This is something that I know we have to understand deeply. We are truly able. This is something I want to mention all these people, but the other person that I just have so much respect for, Cyprian Davis, Brian Massengale. Go on, you young man. In his book, here's a paragraph that I think that we really have to pay attention to tonight. Pope John Paul II, citing an ancient maxim, declared, quote, "Truth is the basis, foundation, and mother of justice," end of quote. Moreover, Brian writes, in reflecting on the challenges of the new millennium, John Paul called for, and here's the phrase somebody needs to write down, a purification of memory as a necessary condition for reconciled relationships between people. A purification of memory. The International Theological Commission explained that this purification of memory, quote, aims at liberating personal and communal conscience from all forms of resentment and violence that are the legacy of past faults, because the consequences of past faults still make themselves felt and can persist as tensions in the present. That's coming out of documents that we never pay any attention to. The healing of memories, the purification of memory, liberating personal, communal conscience from all forms of resentment and violence. And here's the thing that has worn me down over these 70-some years. Well, do we always have to go back and talk about all this stuff? Because after all, that was back in those days, and we've tried to do these things. We've had these workshops, we've had these training sessions, and we really are committing ourselves in our documents to be anti-racism and to also look for diversity and inclusion. And we just don't know what else we're supposed to do. Why do you always want to yell at us and make us feel guilty? I don't know. Good exercise, maybe. I don't know. Yes, I do. Brian Massengate says this: in addition to a more honest account of historical roots of racial injustice, truth-telling requires a certain shifting or reframing of the social narratives. That is, the stock stories social groups tell themselves. That goes back to that dominant narrative. We have gotten to a place, all of those incredible vocations of the 40s and the 50s and the 60s, many of which are in this conversation tonight. Our parents, our relatives thought that we were the gift of God. You want to talk about anybody ask you who you are? But here we are now, sitting in a state of comfort. But I want to ask us to listen to the next song now and understand that the purification of memory is going to take a real journey backwards. Please.
I wait upon the Lord, I wait upon the Lord, I wait upon the Lord my God, who take away the sin of the world. If you want to find Jesus, go in the wilderness, go in the wilderness. Oh, you want to find Jesus, go in the wilderness. Lean in Oh, you want to be a Christian, go in the wilderness. Oh, you want to be a Christian, go in the wilderness. You want to get religion, go in the wilderness. Oh, you want to get religion, go in the wilderness. Yeah, you expect to be converted, go in the wilderness. Go in the wilderness. Oh, you expect to be converted, go in the wilderness. Oh, we've been married, go in the wilderness. Go in the wilderness. Oh, we've been married, go in the wilderness. Hey, afflicted sister, go in the wilderness. Go in the wilderness. Go in the wilderness. Yeah, afflicted sister, go in the wilderness. Hey, half done Christian, go in the wilderness. Go in the wilderness. Go in the wilderness. Oh, half done Christian, go in the wilderness. Oh, come back, slider, go in the wilderness. Go in the wilderness. Go in the wilderness. Oh, come back, slider, go in the wilderness. Baptist member, go in the wilderness. Go in the wilderness. Oh, Baptist member, go in the wilderness. Oh, seek brother Bristol, go in the wilderness. Go in the wilderness. Oh, seek brother Bristol, go in the wilderness. Jesus awaiting to meet you in the wilderness. Oh, Jesus awaiting to meet you in the wilderness.
That song is basic to Lent. Jesus wanders into the desert. But that song is basic to our spirituality. How do we go inside and see how the world we have lived in has fragmented us? That the desires within and the expectations outside are at war quite often. Whatever we do about that uncomfortable truth, whatever we do about those places where guilt might motivate us to stop trying anymore. I don't feel like I can do anything. I just don't know what to do. I just can't. Shh. Go in the wilderness. Jesus is waiting to meet you in the wilderness. And remember this, anybody asks you who you are, you tell them you're a child of God. But the other act of adaptation to this question tonight is, who are we looking for? What would we say would make a good religious in our communities, female or male? What are our expectations and how do we put them through formation? And should we even be asking those questions anymore? Because quite often the real criterion was, do you make me feel comfortable? Do I have to be uptight around you? If so, you don't belong in my space. Oh, but Jesus is waiting to meet you in the wilderness. Now, I'm going to start to close down for tonight anyway. And I'm going to just share some ideas I had that I put into the book To Stand on the Rock back in 1998 or something like that, about the impossibility of a Black man taking vows in a community of men. I don't believe it's possible. I really do not believe that racism allows us to take vows. Ooh, he said. And I'm going to read this paragraph. I wrote it about my own experience within a religious community of men, understanding how racism permeates everything. And also in that book back in 1998, I wrote about the Georgetown enslavement issues with the descendants. And I got that from Cyprian Davis, who had written his book 10 years before. So the New York Times didn't have to tell us about that. These are the stories. But anyway, I said this from my point of view, but adapting it ever so slightly, every woman religious probably asks the same question with another whole aspect of something I want to close down with. And I said this: how can men choose voluntary chastity in a system where the underlying assumption concerning their existence demands that they be judged as promiscuous, licentious, libertines whose cultural flaw concerns sexual impropriety with women and men of all races and ethnic backgrounds? How many men were falsely lynched or mutilated because they were dangerous, sexually out of control animals? All lies, especially since the people doing it were probably the more openly perpetrating those kinds of behaviors. But how can I choose chastity when I have been judged by society as being incapable of self-control of my body? Who of them could choose voluntarily to live lives of apostolic poverty when the culture has made them from the very beginning of American history economic commodities to be bartered, sold, or exploited in whatever marketplace prevails at the time? How can I choose to be voluntarily poor when I have been materially poor all my life because I am vulnerable to the economic disparities of this land? And then, how can men of African descent enthusiastically promise or vow obedience to other men who have been taught and conditioned to expect service and subservience from all African American people, and who must, by definition, rest at the bottom of the social system? To choose such restrictions, based as they are on the prevailing myths of racism and oppression that permeate American culture, to choose such restrictions, based as they are on the prevailing myths of racism and oppression that permeate American culture, is to choose a continuous existence of invisibility, impotence, and insanity. I said it and I maintain it. So why aren't we all stone cold crazy running around talking to trees and inanimate objects? Anybody ask you who you are, you tell them you're a child of God. There is a balm in Gilead. Didn't my Lord deliver Daniel? Joshua fit the battle of Jericho. Every time I feel the Spirit moving in my heart, I will pray. We have been trained and taught by people who knew that we were the gift they gave to the world, and we could not ever have the luxury of giving up. But we can no longer be defined by those terms. Let the young Black, brown, Native people who want to walk through your doorway, even just out of curiosity, let them define your community. And then get away from the hierarchy of the Catholic Church and let us understand quite profoundly that it is not a ladder of ascent to assimilation and fullness, but a circle where we all are listening to and loving one another and accepting one another with the grand grand joy that looks at other people and say, you make me whole. You make me whole. I did not know what I was lacking until you came into my life. That's what love is. That's what solidarity is. That's what community is. And since I was told I only had a certain number of minutes, I'm going to ask our wonderful technicians to now close this down with the song I just led you all into, because it's not about hierarchy. It's about the circle of the sacrament of the Eucharist. It's all about there is nobody who can be left out of the kingdom if our understanding of church is the covenant of remembrance that you yourselves were slaves in Egypt, and therefore you must treat everyone with the same grace that I, the Lord your God, have treated you. In this kingdom, Jesus proved to us morning, noon, and night, there is plenty good room. Thank you all.
There's a room, plenty good room. Oh, there's a room, enough in the kingdom for us all. Yeah, there's a room, plenty good room. Just choose your seat out, sit right down. Yes, in my Father's house, there's so many mansions. Wouldn't have told you, no, had it not been so. And as far as I can see, you know they're waiting for you and me. Just choose your seat out, sit right down. Hey, 3 gates in the east. There's 3 gates in the west. Tell me there's 3 gates in the north, child. There's 3 gates in the south. Hey, don't stay away. Hey, come on, get your draw. Just choose your seat out and sit right down. Hey, don't stay away. Hey, don't stay away. My Lord says there's room enough. There's room enough in the heaven for you. My Lord says there's room enough. So don't stay away.
Before I am silenced forever on this evening, I want to do one other thing that I absolutely intended to do from the very beginning, to actually do what I say should be done. And I want to make sure that I name 2 of the young people who are establishing light in the darkness for their generation as far as scholarship goes. Shannon D. Williams. When she started teaching at Southern Illinois University, I had 4 students the first day of her class in my office saying, Father Brown, do you know this woman, blah, 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 blah. And I said, no, I have never heard of her. Well, she was telling us all about this movie. You know, that movie with about the nuns and all. And I'm going, what you talking about? So I sent her a note and said, Shannon D. Williams, are you talking about the movie I think you're talking about with that ignorant woman? Never mind. So she came up to see me, and I said we had to talk about how that movie with the nun, the fake nun from Las Vegas, was supposed to have been a movie on Thea Bowman, produced by Harry Belafonte,
Yeah.
but it got taken out of control. But Shannon D. Williams is the epitome of what we all dream the next generation of voices will be. And my own point of personal privilege is some of you all know this young man because you've had lunch with him, Anita, is Kevin Winstead, who was put in my car when he was a junior in college by my secretary because she thought I was not competent to drive all over the country by myself. And after 2.5 years of being in the car with me, having met a whole bunch of people out of the National Black Catholic Sisters Conference at joint conferences, he wrote his master's thesis on the Black Catholic Church movement from 1968 to 1992. And those of you who were there know that 1992, he culminated his master's thesis with the National Black Catholic Congress that we had in New Orleans with the iron pots and the brooms. But those two young people are people that I have watched grow into their fullness. We should be doing that every chance we get. Now I am through.
I have heard this child of God speak several times. And each time for me, it has been so inspiring and challenging. And so I don't think a mere thank you justifies what we've heard, what I've heard.
I was at a cocktail party at the house of the man who became eventually Philip Sharper, who became the founding publisher for Orbis Books. And I was part of something called the Jesuit Writers Workshop back in the late 60s. And we went out to New York for this national meeting. I was just a baby Jesuit. And it's 1969, no, 1968, the winter time around 1968, January. And somebody in the kitchen said to me, well, with all that's going on and all these struggles and everything, why do you stay in the Jesuits? And somebody else in the group said, well, just listen to him. He ain't going nowhere. Well, at the same time, I was also in therapy with one of the greatest medical practitioners anybody could ever pray for. And I had to force the Jesuits to let me go and get therapy because they didn't want it to seem like they had any people who were defective. And I said, you've gotten me with a doctor who's turned me into an opioid addict. No, I didn't use that word because I was on 7 pills a day and I was barely functioning. I said, I want to get help. So I forced them to. And after about 1.5 years of therapy, Dr. Dermot Paul Andrew Smith said to me, many religious come to me for counseling and therapy, and I recommend to almost every single one of them that they leave religious life. You, however, need to stay. So I stayed. But I'm going to tell the story about my mama talking to 3 young Jesuits at St. Joseph's Church in East St. Louis one Sunday morning before Mass. We'd come over from St. Louis and she was in her usual position in the aisle. And Monsignor Driscoll walked out to light the candles for the 8 o'clock Mass. And my mother leaned forward in her own dramatic fashion and said to my companions, you see that man up there? He don't like Black people. He throws communion at us because he's afraid his fingers might touch our lips.
Oh.
But that's all right. I don't come here to pray to the Monsignor. I come here to pray to Jesus. And there we have it. If my mother and father were turned away from the Catholic Church while they were still taking instructions the first time around, but they persisted, I didn't have to know Thea Bowman to say I come to my church fully functioning. That's the theme of every single one of us who have persisted. Why would I want to leave my house? If you got bad behavior, you might want to correct your behavior, but I'm not leaving because you don't know how to behave.
Mm-hmm. Mhm.
So
It's
there.
someone says it's a challenge to be a contributing citizen of our own nation or nations and members of the church. Do you think we must first confront our own need to speak truth about the past and to seek personal reparation? How do we then move toward institutional reparation?
You know, people make a joke when they see me quite often. Anyway, they used to. Oh, here comes a troublemaker. And you did that thing about the good trouble in John Lewis, as we remembered him and honored him from yesterday.
Yes.
Um, and I said this when I got some award here about 3 years ago. You know, I'm sick and tired of people calling me a troublemaker. If you got a pain in your side and you go to the doctor's office and he says, I think you've got lung cancer, the doctor's not a troublemaker. He's trying to get you out of the trouble. And it might have been your past behaviors and your own practices that got you into trouble. So I don't see myself as a troublemaker.
Mm-hmm.
And I do think I get tired, but how are we going to be Christian otherwise? There's only one option, and that is, to quote James Cone and other people, speak truth to power. But I don't do it from a position of being deficient. That's why we started this evening off with anybody ask you who you are, you tell them you're a child of God.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So confronting it within, of course we have to confront it within. Every single one of us should be doing that every day. And during the season of Lent, even more so. But I'm not going to wait for the world to change, because I have a rule. If I can't change the world ain't going to change me.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Father Brown, there's a question here. How can minority members in our communities instigate conversations around racism?
They shouldn't.
Okay.
I don't think I should be instigating anything. And as part of some of the participants in this event tonight are some of the most special people in my life. The young Jesuits who have started the Jesuit Anti-Racism Sodality. And I have told them any number of times that I've been praying to see them since I was their age or younger. They have instituted the conversation. They have pushed it forward. They have collaborated across this country, even though they've gotten pushback and some really skeptical responses from people, quote, in power or authority. Well, you're not out of formation yet. You're not supposed to, and you can't, and you don't, and They saw the need. They're carrying on the conversation. All I need to do is show up. Ask me how I'm feeling. What do I want for dinner? But don't be asking me to tell you what racism is. I stopped doing that a long time ago.
There's another question, it's quite lengthy. It says, in our group, we reframed the second question about strategies for increasing numbers of vocations to our communities to call the question about how and what we support vocation discernment in general and to religious life and to life itself. Okay, then it says performing, examining our understanding and beliefs about the nature of vocation itself. And do we honestly believe that people other than white people have authentic vocations to this life?
That was the reason I babbled on for 53 minutes.
Yes.
That's the reason why the National Black Catholic Sisters Conference, and I gotta say this now, y'all are being too modest here. Because I can remember, no, let's just be honest. When I made that little offhand comment about there's no such thing as the Black community or the church, let's also say there's no such thing as the Black Catholic Church. because when the priests got started, they didn't want the seminarians meeting with them.
Mm-hmm.
So we wound up being invited into the sisters conference down the hall or across the building. If it weren't for the Black Catholic Sisters Conference, how would Thea Bowman have found herself? How would Antona have managed, or Sister Roland Lagarde survived? And the three faces I'm looking at on this screen right now, you all are the epitome of what this has always been about. But you've been leaders in ways of forming community and sustaining people. And on occasions, pulling an archbishop out into the lobby and telling him what's wrong with him.
Mm.
Not that I ever remember Sister Mary Alice Chenoweth doing that to Archbishop Like, but that's another story.
Hope Magna Marie is listening. This question, Father Brown, I have to think about the question, well, Father, how can we expect Black men and women to make religious vows? Can you speak more to that?
I think that that's a question that the community into which we admit ourselves has to ask the question. Exactly what are your thoughts about these vows when you look at us? I can remember this young man who came from South Dakota into the Jesuits back in the 1970s. He didn't survive the novitiate. And he told me one night when we were sitting having a personal conversation in Omaha when he was visiting our high school there, that he had gone through the Lakota process of going out praying for a vision. And he knew he was supposed to come into the Society of Jesus. And his classmates and some people on the staff kept pushing him about, oh, that's the way you used to pray, but now you have to pray our way.
Mm-hmm.
I was furious. And from the time of Father DeSmet going out to work in the West among the Native people, we've had one religious vocation from South Dakota, Native people, in my entire 60-some years as a Jesuit. And he was a brother, because quite often minorities came into the Society of Jesus as brothers and not scholastics to be ordained. One vocation as a brother. Now, that's what I meant when I brought up the whole thing about what makes a good religious. What are we looking for? Do we want somebody who's already assimilated so we never have to have any problems? That's also why I brought up about 5 minutes ago about treat me like your cancer specialist. If you always got to be arguing and pushing us, when they turned me down for ordination, my spiritual director happened to be a canon lawyer. And so he called the provincial staff and said, what's the problem here? I wrote the canonical letter saying he was qualified to be ordained this summer. So why are you telling him now, 3 weeks before the diaconate, that he's not qualified? They went back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. And man, he was the rector of our theology community and a canon lawyer. And I made sure he's the one who vested me at my ordination, but that's another story. So he said, well, then why didn't you talk to, I was sitting in the room, statute of limitations is over now, and I think they're all dead. I was sitting in the room listening to his side of the group conversation. He said, well, why haven't you brought this up to him a long time ago? And we hung the phone up and he said, you know what their argument was? Every time we ask him to do something, we get a fight out of him. Yes, because you don't know who I am. And why can't you just accept the fact that I might be able to bring something new to your community and you don't have to shape me into what has always been the standard in your community? Mm-hmm. In fact, if you allow me to be creative, I might bring your community to places that it has never been before. Mm-hmm. So the question of who are you looking for is crucial Well, we just don't, so and so, they just don't seem to fit in the community. We've had this major discussion in the past. How many Black religious women and men live by themselves or within a very restricted number of people? Until Antona Ebo got too sick to take care of herself. She was already, 90, 91 years old before they said, you got to go into this assisted living place. She was in a retirement home, but she had her own apartment and had took care of her own self. When I took the young man I was talking about, Kevin Winstead, up there to do a 2-hour oral interview with her. Oh, no, 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 no. You've got people, Jesuits, all across this country, not that there's more than 12 or 13 of us African-American, but you got us living, I've been by myself living in a community of my own since 1984. And one Jesuit who just recently died a couple of weeks ago accused me of being completely non-Jesuit because I live by myself. And the provincial, who was also trying to get rid of me, said, he lives more of an authentic Jesuit life than we do, by himself. But that shouldn't be but of course that is part of the Society of Jesus original charism, to go off and do things and then come back home and get your horse renewed or whatever. We have got to understand that anti-Catholicism in the United States forced people to live in groups out of protection as much as anything else. That's where the Society of Jesus went off the deep end after our restoration into an anti-Catholic environment. We're going to group together. Well, that's just not normal. But it's become a witness of, you see how proud and prosperous we are. Well, that's not what we're supposed to be giving witness to. Not to our economic stability and protection. We're giving witness to the fact that after we've worked 8, 12, 14, 16 hours a day, we come home and we don't have to explain ourselves. That to me ought to be religious community. Anyway, I didn't talk too much.
Well, Reverend, another question. How can we gently bring into consciousness the racism of the white majority being in community? I need to read that again.
Yes, you do.
How can we gently bring into consciousness the racism of the white majority beginning in community?
Well, I think you should probably have a nice, pleasant look on your face, smile in a slight way, and with a low tone of voice say, that was offensive and you have to change. Because my mama said you can always be polite, but if you're wrong, you're wrong. I have corrected very powerful people when they wanted to call me Joe, because that was not my name. I mean, they thought they were powerful people. The chancellor of our university today, nice, wonderful man. I had to correct him walking away from lunch today because he said we need to get the Black faculty and staff together and have a kumbaya moment. Ha, 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 ha. I said, stop right there. And I sent him the essay I wrote on why kumbaya happens to be the first text of Black liberation theology in the United States of America. And he went and he read it. He went home and read it, and it came back and said, you got to learn something new every day. I just think that if something's wrong, I'm just going to tell you. Now, how you deal with that will be interesting to all of us. But if I see something wrong, why would I not want to say something? That would show that I don't really believe in the other person's ability to change. I think it's a mark of respect to say, excuse me, that didn't work. You might want to change it. Well,
so much for this. I think Sister Josita is going to offer a few closing thanks, and then I'll do a little one as well.
Yes. In reading over the many of the comments and then my own thinking and hearing and listening to you, Reverend, We are indeed grateful for the challenge, for the insight, for the lessons that you always teach us. And it's not so much, as you were saying, that we listen, it's in the action. It's what do we do when we leave here? What is it that we do? And even through the songs that you played, the gospel music had a beautiful message for all of us. So once again, I wish, I'm grateful. And it seems that many others are grateful. One group said we didn't get finished with our discussion. But I think we have the recording here, and if they need to hear you again, we need to hear you again, and hopefully we will actualize what we've heard you say. So
Thank you.
thank you.
Thank you. You know, you
And I,
mean the world to me. Thank you.
and I too want to add my thanks, Father Joseph Brown. Um, as your sister, if I may, I want to just apologize to you for all the ways you have been treated uh, as if you are anything less than the fullest child of God, beloved of our Lord. And I have no such power except my own person to say that to you as your sister. But I am sorry for all the ways throughout these years, because that is something no one, you do not, cannot be treated like this. And so I thank you for being willing to be with us. You're right. This is the work of culturally created white majority, and it's ours to do. But I must also say we can't do it without you,
Right. No.
without all the people who are willing to be in these conversations. And I know they're painful. And I too am pained by our history and our story, and yet you also give us through music, through your witness, through the our own God who offers us so much, that path to truth telling, speaking truth, and naming what must be named, and together having the difficult conversations, because maybe they're not difficult, they're holy conversations. They're the sacred way we're being called to at this point. So I thank you for being with us, for honoring us with your presence, with your wisdom. I am certain people will be listening to these videos more than once, because there was so much in there. So I'm grateful. I
I
also,
want to say that the part you said about the apology was taken care of the minute you organized this gathering. That's what we need to pay attention to. We talk about things have to move to action, but you helped to organize this gathering. If we didn't know the authenticity and the integrity and the honesty of where you are coming from and what you bring with you, none of us would be part of this. So the apology, my brother never apologized for sexually abusing me when I was 7. He never found a way to do that. But you know what? That man loved me until after he died in ways that were profoundly redemptive and reconciling. He acted out his need to be reconciled. If we had more of that, we would have fewer letters on racism. So I would say, I thank you for that apology, but it was already deposited in the bank before you ever said it.
thank you. It still needs to be said, though,
I know.
again and again and again and again.